So music takes up a lot, if not most, of my free time. And as a bagpiper, my primary instrument is an ethnic one. So coming up with a broad idea for my final paper was a pretty easy decision. I knew I wanted to explore how American music was impacted by various immigrant groups at different points in time. However, I had some trouble determining which side of the fence my thesis would fall. Was American music a cohesive fabric of assimilated voices, or was it a complex, multicultural layering of different voices? And as we moved through the class materials, I realized that most of what I thought I knew about American immigration was wrong, or at best, incomplete. The American melting pot ideal that I was taught growing up was pretty much blown out of the water in our first lecture. And as I read through our assigned materials, it seemed to me that Americanization/assimilation efforts failed at pretty much every turn. It's just unreasonable and unfair to think that immigrants would give up all emotional and cultural ties just to have the opportunity to build a better life financially and politically in America. And prior to the start of the class, I felt that multiculturalism was synonymous with multinationalism, and that was just not what the United States was about. I now understand that multiculturalism has very little to do with multinationalism, and I've come to believe that the legacy of United States immigration is that it has built a strong multicultural nation of Americans. And from there, I was able to finalize my thesis into focusing on how, despite efforts to the contrary, the United States is a multicultural nation. And I can explore that through the various ways that immigrants have layered upon America's musical landscape. My first two primary sources in this exploration are both from Henry Didymus, a pen name for Edward Henry Durrell, a man who would later become mayor of New Orleans and a federal court judge. The first of his works is a book called New Orleans as I Found It, and it was published in 1845. It describes New Orleans during the height of the domestic slave trade era in 1835 to 1836, and has accounts of slave music and dance. The second work is an article from Graham's American Monthly magazine from 1853, and summarizes the accomplishments of one of the first early American composers, Louis M. Gottschalk, who was born in New Orleans to an English immigrant father and a Creole mother. He was one of the first people to begin to merge African slave music with more mainstream music of the time. The article is relevant in discussing the popular music of the early half of the 1800s, as well as one of the first descriptions of New Orleans as Congo Square, which became the major locus of West Indian and African American music and culture. The second era I decided to focus on was that of the Chinese immigration in California. And to illustrate Chinese culture during this time, Quang Chang Ling wrote 4 letters to the San Francisco Argonaut magazine making a case for Chinese immigrants in America. In his letters, Ling refers to himself as a Mandarin high in authority selected by his countrymen to speak for them on their behalf. He discusses the Chinese civilization, gives a brief view of what life is like for Chinese immigrants, and discusses American policy regarding Chinese immigration, including free trade and what rights should be extended to new immigrants. Now, while Ling is not a musician, these letters provide context for the Chinese culture that's building in America during the late 1800s, and I'm able to use this narrative along with valuable secondary sources to establish how American music was influenced by Chinese immigration. Now, arguably, one of the most influential American groups on American popular music were the Russian Jewish immigrants, who settled in New York City and eventually formed the musical hub known as Tin Pan Alley. Now, one of the most famous composers of Tin Pan Alley was Irving Berlin, who, among others, wrote the song God Bless America. So the source I focused on, however, is a book called Out of the Shadow. This is Rose Gollop Cohen's autobiography and narrates how she was born in Russia in 1880 and immigrated to the Lower East Side of New York in 1892, after the Russians began systematically attacking Jewish communities. Although the author is, again, not a participant in the popular music scene emerging from the Jewish communities at this time, The narrative details life within an immigrant community from a female perspective during the rise of what would become known as Tin Pan Alley. I also use this source in combination with a secondary source to highlight the importance of this immigrant group on American popular music. Finally, in my research, I learned that many pro-immigration groups would host cultural exhibitions to showcase immigrant art, music, and dance to the broader American public. The book Immigrant Gifts to American Life by Alan Eaton details several exhibitions of European folklife culture in 4 cities, specifically with impressions of each with regards to art and music. In the latter part of the book, it also discusses procedures for setting up further exhibitions. Now, while Eaton does not discuss the restrictive immigration policies of the 1930s directly, he does make an indirect case for more liberal immigration policies by highlighting the influences of folk traditions on the wider American culture. The focus of the book is solely on European immigrants, and over 20 countries are discussed at varying levels of detail. It is interesting how the author attempts to persuade a reluctant American public how traditional European folk art and music is beneficial to and able to be integrated into the wider American culture. So in summary, I really believe that Americanizing immigrants has more to do with Americans opening up and incorporating new layer of cultural expressions from immigrants than it has to do with immigrants assimilating themselves into some kind of made-up, idealized version of American culture. And that is really what I hope to illustrate in my final project.